Cold has a taste, and it tastes like blood and copper pennies. Not the clean white nothing the word promises. It is iron on the tongue, the inside of the cheek gone numb and then split, the throat scraped raw with breathing air that has teeth. She knelt in 8 inches of new snow with her arms wrapped around a 3-month-old child and felt her own knees stop being hers, felt the wet of the drift climb her shins like a thing that wanted in. The wind off the pass came down at 30 miles an hour, and it did not howl. It pressed, flat and patient, the way a man leans his whole weight on a door he means to keep shut. 1 woman. 1 baby. 11 miles of grade behind her, and 1,000 miles of white in front. She bared her teeth at the dark, and meant to die there before she would crawl back down to the way station and beg the man who put her off the stage. Then a shape came out of the timber that was darker than the timber, and a voice scraped through the wind, low as a stove door dragging on its hinge. "You'll lose the boy first." The stage out of Quartz Gulch ran twice a week when the weather held, a mud wagon with a canvas top and a 6-horse hitch, and on the morning of the 11th of November in 1878, it carried 4 men, a strong box of assay silver, and a woman with a baby, and a carpet bag, and not enough money. Her name was Maren Vance. She was 21 years old. She had 110 miles of frozen wheel rut between her and the railhead at Corinne, and 40 cents in a knotted handkerchief, and a fare that the agent's chalkboard had set at $4.50. She had counted it 3 times in the dark of the depot before she boarded, hoping the arithmetic would change. It did not. Arithmetic never did. She had set her jaw the way she always did before a hard thing, chin down, both hands gone still and deliberate in her lap, the way she had once held a thread steady against a loom that never stopped for anyone. And she had climbed up into the mud wagon anyway, because the only thing waiting for her behind was worse than the cold. She had been a loom girl in a Pennsylvania mill town, then a wife for 14 months, then a widow. Her husband had been a thin coughing man named Thomas Stagg, who answered an advertisement and paid a marriage broker $11 for a bride sent west in a railcar, and Maren had been the bride, shipped like a bolt of cloth with a tag on it. She buried Thomas in August of a lung sickness the doctor called miner's consumption, and before the dirt had settled, his brother came to the door. Harlan Stagg owned a roadhouse and a freight contract and a quarter of the camp's whiskey, and he stood in her doorway and told her, gently, the way a man explains a sum to a child, that she had come west on a paper, and the paper did not stop at 1 stag. He looked at the baby in the cradle, Thomas's son, 3 weeks old then, and he said the boy was stag blood, and stag blood stayed where the stags could see it. She had $31 Thomas left her. She spent 26 of it on a fare to anywhere, and she ran. So she rode out of Quartz Gulch in the cold with her son against her chest and $4.10 short, and she prayed the agent at the next stop would not check the chalk against the cash until they were too far gone to turn back. It was a thin prayer, and the cold ate it. At the second way station, a low log roadhouse where the road bent up toward the pass, the stage agent climbed down to water the horses and count the way bills, and he held his cracked ledger up to the gray light and ran a stub of pencil down the column, and he came to her name and her fare and her 40 cents, and he did the arithmetic that she had already done 100 times. He did not even raise his voice. He simply looked at her the way the loom boss had looked at a broken bobbin, and he said the word that ends every argument on the frontier. Short. The stage driver was a man named Renner, with a face chapped to the color of brick, and a chuckle he gave the men beside him before he said anything cruel. He gave it now, that low, ugly sound, and told her the company did not run a charity, and the 4 men inside the wagon looked at the canvas roof, or their boots, or the frost on the window glass, anywhere but at her, a loud drummer in a checked coat, Dab Moory, a roadhouse man down from the gulch, leaned out and said a pretty enough woman could always work off a fare, and laughed at his own wit, and no one stopped him. Maren swore she would pay the rest at Corinne, swore it on the boy's life. The agent said the company had heard that song. She said the boy would die in this cold. The agent said that was a hard thing, and not the company's, and he took her carpet bag down off the rack and set it in the snow. Then he reached for the brass fare check on its loop of cord around her neck, the punch token the depot man had given her at Quartz Gulch, stamped with the line's name and the number of the seat, and lifted it over her head and snapped the cord, because the company did not let a short fare keep the check, and flicked it into the drift at the edge of the road. It landed face up in the new snow, a small, dull yellow coin of metal, the only warm-colored thing in all that white. Then they put her off the stage. She stood in the road and watched the mud wagon labor up the first grade and bend out of sight behind the timber, the canvas top swaying, the 6 horses leaning into the collars, and the silence it left behind was the loudest thing she had ever heard. The roadhouse keeper came out onto the porch and told her she could not stay. The company leased him the building, and he would not cross the company over a stranger's bad luck. He said it almost kindly. That was the worst of it. She asked how far to the next shelter. He looked up the pass at the sky, gone the flat dead white of a fish's belly, and said a trapper kept a cabin somewhere up the grade if she could find it before dark, and that she would not find it before dark, and he went back inside and barred the door. She bent down and picked the brass fare check out of the snow and put it in her fist, not because it was worth anything. It was worth nothing now, a punched token for a seat she no longer had, but because it was the last thing anyone had handed her, and she could not yet make her fingers let it go. Then she turned her back on the warm window and started walking up the pass, because the cold ahead would only kill her, and the thing behind her would do worse. She walked until the road stopped being a road and became a suggestion of one under the snow. She walked with the baby buttoned inside her coat against her skin, his breath a small, steady warmth at her collarbone, the one furnace left in the world. She had on thin town boots and a wool dress and a shawl, and the wind took the heat out of all of it the way water takes the heat out of a stone. By the time the light began to fail, she could not feel her feet, and the not feeling had begun to climb. She knew what that was. She told herself she would not sit down, and then she was on her knees in the drift with no memory of falling, and the boy was crying, a thin, reedy sound, swallowed by the wind almost before it left him. And she understood, with the cold clarity that comes when the body stops lying to you, that he would freeze before she did. The small ones always went first. She bent over him and breathed on his face and screamed at the storm with everything left in her, a sound with no words in it. The storm pressed back, flat and patient. That was when the timber moved. He came down out of the lodgepole pines without hurry, a big man made bigger by a fur coat that still wore the shape of the animal it had been, and he did not run, and he did not call out, and he did not, when he reached her, waste a single motion. He went down on one knee and put 2 fingers against the baby's throat, then against hers, reading them the way a man reads a trapline. Not gently, not roughly, only quickly, the cold, mechanical focus of a wolf reading a deer. His face was a flat gray nothing under a beard gone half to ice, and he smelled of wood smoke and wet bear hide and the iron tang of cold. "You'll lose the boy first," he said, which was the truth and not a comfort. Then he shrugged out of the great fur coat and dropped it over the both of them, and the inside of it was warm as a banked stove, and she flinched from the size of him and got one hand up between them, the brass fare check still locked in her fist, as if a punched stage token could ward off a man who could break her like a green stick. He did not seem to notice the raised hand. He looked at the boy and at the dead white sky and said one thing before he gathered them against his chest and stood as though they weighed nothing. "Cabin's a mile. Hold the boy and don't fight me. There's no daylight for it." She did not remember most of that mile. She remembered the jolt of his stride and the wall of his chest and the unbelievable, shameful relief of being warm, and she remembered hating that relief, because the last man who carried her anywhere had carried her off a railcar and into a marriage she had not chosen. She remembered the baby going quiet against her, and her panic that quiet meant dead, and the man's low voice, not looking down. "He's sleeping. Warm ones sleep, cold ones cry. Let him sleep." She remembered the trees thinning and a black shape resolving out of the dusk. A one-room log cabin built back against a granite cliff, so the mountain itself was its fourth wall, a stovepipe breathing a thin straight line of smoke, a lean-to off the gable end. She remembered the iron weight of the door swinging in, a wash of heat off a low fire, the smell of tallow and pelts and pine pitch, and then the floor came up slow, and she went down into the dark, the man's hands keeping her head from the planks. When she came back, she lay on a rope-strung bunk under a weight of furs, her boots off, her bare feet wrapped in flannel and propped near, not against, never against, the iron stove, and a fire roared in it, and her son was alive. That was the first thing she made herself be sure of. He was alive. He lay in a wooden box that had held cartridges, lined with a folded elk hide, 3 feet from the stove, his small face flushed pink with returned heat, his fists working in his sleep. She got up on one elbow, and her feet screamed when the blood came back into them, a burning like coals shoved under the nails, and she bit it down and did not cry out, because crying out was a thing you did when you wanted help, and she had stopped expecting help a long time ago. The man was on the far side of the room with his back to her, doing something at a rough plank table by the light of a tallow dip. He had not lit the good lamp. He was a careful man with oil. He did not turn around when her breathing changed, but he knew she was awake. She could tell by the way his shoulders settled. "Frostbites in your 2 smallest toes and the edge of the left foot," he said to the wall, in the flat voice of a man reading a freight manifest. "Not deep. You kept moving. That saved them. They'll burn for a few days and the skin'll come off and they'll be ugly. You'll keep the toes." A pause, the small scrape of a knife on whetstone. "Boy's fine. He was warmer than you. You did right, keeping him on your skin." She did not know what to say to a man who saved your life and your child's life, and then handed it to you as a frostbite report. So she said the thing the loom boss and the broker and the agent had all trained into her, the only language she trusted. "What's the toll?" Her voice came out a cracked whisper. "For the room. For the wood. I'll pay it. I don't have it now, but I always pay what I owe." For the first time he turned around. The firelight caught the long white scar through one eyebrow, and the dark, unkempt hair, and the eyes that were the gray of a sky before snow, and she braced, chin down, hands gone still on the furs. For the arithmetic, for the chalk against the cash, for the price. His jaw worked once before the words came, the way a rusted thing moves before it turns. "There's no toll," he said. "You're not on the company's books up here. There's no chalkboard on this mountain." He looked at her hand, where her fingers were still curled, even now, around the small brass fare check on its broken cord. "And put that down. It can't punch you up here. The road's 11 miles that way." Then he turned back to his whetstone, and the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. His name was Caleb Wren. She learned it the way she learned everything that first week, in single-dropped words pried out of a silence that filled the cabin like water fills a well. He was 38. He had come up this pass 11 winters back and had not gone down it for more than supplies since. He trapped marten and fox and the occasional wolf, and twice a year packed the pelts to the Cheyenne traders at Fort Benton and came back with powder, lead, flour, coffee, salt, and a small, heavy poke of gold dust he kept in a tin behind a stone in the chimney and had no use for at all. He had been a soldier once. She learned that not from any word, but from the way he came up out of sleep the second night when the lean-to goat knocked a pail over onto the balls of his feet with a knife in his hand and his face gone to that flat gray nothing before he was even awake, and the long minute it took him to come back from wherever the sound had sent him. He gave her the bunk and the boy the cartridge box, and the first night, when the blizzard truly came down and sealed the pass, and the cold outside fell to a place where spit froze before it struck the ground, Caleb Wren took 2 hides and went out to sleep in the lean-to with the goat. She lay awake that first full night of the storm, listened to the wind try the door, and did not understand him. The one fixed law of her world was that nothing came free, that a roof had a price, and the price was always, in the end, her. She had braced for it in the block of his arms in the snow, She had braced for it on the bunk, and the man had gone out to sleep with the goat in air that could kill him sooner than spend one night under a roof with a woman who might think she owed him for it. She did not trust it. She had her dead husband's folding knife, a cheap 3-inch thing with a bone handle, and the second day, while he ran the trap line, she hid it up her sleeve against her wrist and kept it there for weeks. Not because she had caught him at anything, because she had never once in 21 years met a kindness that did not turn out to be a lien. On the second morning, the storm still had them sealed in, and the cabin was a single room 10 feet by 14 with 2 grown people and a baby and a fire that had to be fed all night, and the only thing to do was learn to live inside the same 4 walls without touching. He showed her the place without ever calling it rules. Break the skin of ice on the water bucket before you drink. Feed the stove from the small split first, then the rounds. Never let it go to coals after dark. The boy slept 3 feet from the stove, because a man who had once watched a fire warm a cradle knew exactly how warm and exactly how far, and he did not look at her when she had to see to the baby, or change her torn stockings, or wash. He turned to the wall and became very interested in his work, and nothing about it was performed. No chivalry, no show. It was the plain habit of a man who had decided long ago what kind of man he would be when no one was watching. She tried, the third day, to pay. It was the only language she had. His elk-hide coat hung by the door with a long tear up one sleeve seam, and she had her sewing kit in the carpet bag. Needles, a hank of waxed linen thread, her thimble worn to a silver shine on the loom and after, and she sat by the fire and mended it with the small even stitches that had once filled a mill's order book and made the seam stronger than new. When he came in stamping snow and found her finishing it, he stood very still, and his jaw worked, and she thought she had trespassed on the one thing a solitary man kept whole, his own coat. Then he took it and turned it to the firelight and ran his rough thumb down the row of stitches the way another man runs a thumb down a column of figures. "That's tighter than the factory put it," he said. It was the nearest thing to wonder she had heard from him. "It's payment," she said. "Toward the room." And the wonder went out of his face like a lamp pinched off, and the flat gray came down. "Stop that. Stop trying to pay me back. There's no ledger up here. You sewed a coat because the coat was torn. That's all that happened." He hung it back on its peg. "When you make every kindness a debt, you're teaching yourself that nobody does a thing for free, and I'm too old and it's too cold to be your proof of that all winter." Then he went back out into the wind to check a trap he had already checked, because he needed to not be in the room. On the 4th morning the storm broke, and a sun came up over the saw-toothed ridge so bright on the new snow that it hurt to look at, and the world outside the iron door was a hard, blue-and-white nothing that stretched to the curve of the earth. The pass was closed. He told her that plainly, the way he told her everything. The drifts on the grade were over a man's head in the cuts. Nothing would move up or down that road until the April thaw cut it open. 5 months off. They were sealed in together until spring. He said it without apology and without weight, a fact like the depth of the snow, and then he handed her a pair of his own wool socks, vast on her ruined feet, and a tin cup of black coffee. And he went to skin the marten he had brought in frozen, and that was the whole of the announcement that she would be living in this man's one room until the snow that had nearly killed her finally let her go. So began the long arithmetic of the winter, the only kind Maren Vance had ever fully trusted. The firewood divided by the days, the flour divided by the weeks, the cold subtracted from the dark hours and added back at dawn. She kept the count without meaning to. It was how her mind worked. It had kept her sane on the loom and in the marriage and on the run. On the 5th day, she watched him split wood and saw the rick by the door was lower than 5 months would need, and she said so because numbers were the one place her voice did not shake. He looked at the rick and at her. "You can count," he said. It was not a question. She told him she had kept a mill's piece tally for 3 years before she was sent west. He handed her the splitting maul the next morning, and her ledger-keeper's hands, soft from thread and paper, came apart on the helve in 3 days. Blisters, then broken blisters, then the slow building of something harder. And he did not coddle them, and he did not stop her, because he had heard the thing under her counting, the refusal to be carried. She learned to split wood. On the 6th day, she learned to skin a marten without tearing the pelt, his big scarred hands guiding hers once, exactly once on the first cut along the inside of the leg, then withdrawing and letting her ruin 2 hides before she got the 3rd one clean. She learned to render fat into tallow and dip the rushes that gave the small light, to set a snare for the snowshoe hare on the runs at the timber's edge, and to read the cabin's own weather. When the stovepipe sang a certain pitch, the wind had backed north, and a storm was 3 hours out. She learned to swaddle the boy so he could not work a hand free in the night and lose it, the way Caleb showed her without saying how he came to know it. And the boy, a thin, pale, fretful thing on the stage, grew fat and loud and pink on the goat's milk. Caleb drew morning and night, kicking and shrieking in his cartridge box by the warm stove, while the storms walked over the roof. And there were whole hours when Maren forgot to be afraid, and then caught herself forgetting, and did not know what to do with that. She named the goat. It was a foolish thing, and she did it anyway, on the 8th day, when she had gone out to the lean-to in the blue dark to fetch the morning milk, and the goat had butted her hip with its hard, flat head, and looked at her with its long, solemn, yellow-eyed face like a circuit preacher disappointed in the collection, and she had laughed, actually laughed, the sound rusty in her own throat, and called it Deacon. When she told Caleb, expecting him to say a goat was meat and milk, and not a thing you named, he only said, Deacon, trying the word, and then, he's got the face for it, and went on splitting wood, and she understood that she had been let further into the cabin than the door. The 8th day was also the day the tension snapped. It had been building under the work like ice building under snow, the strain of 2 wary animals in a den, 10 feet by 14, and it broke not over anything large but over the gold. She had found it, not searched for it, found it when a chunk of mud chinking fell out beside the chimney stone, and she went to push it back and felt the cold round shape of a tin behind the rock, and pried it loose, a poke of gold dust the size of 2 fists, more money than she had seen in her life, dust enough to carry a woman and a child to the railhead, and on to San Francisco, and into a clean rented room with a sewing machine and a lock only she held the key to. She knelt there with the tin in her 2 hands and the whole of her old dream of escape running up her arms like fever heat, when the door opened and Caleb Wren came in out of the cold and saw her holding his gold. She got up fast, too fast, the knife sliding down into her palm out of long habit, and she stood with her back to the chimney and the tin in one hand and the little bone-handled knife in the other, and her chin down and her hands, for once, not still at all but shaking, and she said in the flat voice of a person who has decided to be hated rather than surprised, I wasn't taking it. The chinking fell. I'll put it back. I wasn't taking it. She heard her own voice break on the last of it. She had braced for this moment for 8 days. She had known the kindness would turn, and here it was, turning. She raised the knife a few inches, not at him, just up, the way she had raised the brass fare check against him in the snow, a useless small thing held between herself and a man who could take whatever he wanted. I know what comes now, she said. Go on, then. And Caleb Wren stood in the doorway with the cold pouring in around him and looked at the gold in her hand and the knife in her hand and her face, and the flat gray nothing came down, and he did the last thing she expected. He stepped to the side, away from the door, and left it open behind him, the way clear, the gesture plain, and said, very low, If you want it, take it. Take the boy and the gold, and go. If you'd rather chance the snow than chance me, I'll break trail far as the way station. I won't stop you, and I won't follow. He let that sit. Then his jaw worked, and the rest came slow, the most words she had yet heard him say at once. But I'll tell you something, and then I'll never say it again. I have not touched you because nobody is going to say I bought you with a coat in the snow, the way that man bought you with a fare he then took back, the way the brother bought you with a paper after the first was in the ground. I know what was done to you. I read it on you like sign on snow. The flinch, the way you make every cup of coffee a debt, The dead husband's knife up your sleeve you think I don't know about." Her breath stopped. "I've known about it since the second day. I let you keep it because a person ought to be able to defend herself in her own home, and this is your home as long as the snow holds. Keep the knife. Keep the gold if you take it. But don't you ever again stand in this house and tell me you know what comes now. Because nothing comes now. Nothing has a price up here. That's the whole point of up here." And he turned and walked back out into the killing cold and pulled the door shut, gentle, behind him, and left her at the chimney with a fortune in one hand and a knife in the other, and not one word in her mouth. She put the gold back behind the stone. She pushed the chinking in over it with her thumb. She did not, that night, put the knife back up her sleeve. She set it on the shelf by the brass fare check she had somehow never thrown away, and she lay in the bunk and listened to the man breathe in the lean-to through the wall, 15 feet and a granite cliff and 11 years of solitude away. And for the first time since a rail car had carried her west like freight, she let herself cry, not from fear, which she knew, but from something she did not have a word for and would not find one for until the night the fever came. The days after that were different and the same. They did not speak of the gold, but the wariness had broken its skin like the ice on the water bucket, and underneath it ran something warmer. He began to talk, not much, never much, but a sentence where before there would have been silence. She learned on the 14th day, splitting wood beside him in the blue cold, that he had stood at a creek called Shiloh in Tennessee in the April of 1862, 22 years old, and walked into a peach orchard in the morning with men he had grown up with and walked out of it alone and could not sleep since in a closed room with other men breathing, which was why he had come up a mountain where the only thing that breathed was the wind. She learned on the 19th day, when she found the flat stone grave behind the cabin under the snow with its marker worn smooth, that he had not always been alone, that a woman had shared the cabin 8 winters back, and a baby and a fever that came up the same pass the snow came up, and that he had ridden 2 days down to the gulch for a doctor and come back too late and buried them both and stayed to keep the grave company because he could not think where else to be. He told it flatly, the way he told her the depth of the snow, and only once, and she understood then why he drew the goat's milk for her son morning and night and never once held the boy himself. She understood why he had said, "In the snow, you'll lose the boy first." He had lost the boy first. "The worst part," he said that night, the only time his voice ever cracked the whole of the winter, looking into the stove and not at her, "isn't the cold. It's that when you finally scream up here, the only thing that hears you is the trees." And Maren Vance, who had screamed into a blizzard with no words in it and been heard, after all, by a shape that came out of the timber. Maren set down her sewing and crossed the 10 feet of plank floor and sat beside him on the bench by the stove, not touching, never touching, just there, and let him hear another living thing not be the trees. They sat like that until the fire burned down to the rounds, and neither of them said the thing that was happening, because saying it would have been a kind of paper, and they had both had enough of paper. It was the boy who broke the last of the distance, the way the smallest one always breaks it, and he did it by nearly dying. It came on the 31st day, in the dead black heart of February, with a storm walking over the roof that had not let up in 3 days. Maren woke in the night to a sound that turned her blood to slush. The boy not crying, but laboring, each small breath a wet, rattling pull, like a man dragging a chain through gravel. She had him out of the cartridge box and against her in an instant, and felt the heat coming off him, a furnace where a baby should be warm, and she knew, with the cold clarity that had never once lied to her, that this was the lung fever, the same drowning sickness that had taken his father in August and the doctor said took the small ones fastest of all. She did the only thing she knew, which was nothing, which was to hold him and rock him and tell him to breathe, and it was not enough, and his lips were going the wrong color in the firelight, a blue at the edges like the shadows on the snow, and she heard herself begin to make the wordless sound again, the storm sound. And then Caleb Wren was off the floor and across the room, and his big scarred hand was flat against the boy's chest, reading the rattle through his palm. He did not panic. That was the thing that saved them. That the man who could not sleep in a closed room with breathing men was, in the face of a sick child, the calmest thing in the cabin. He had buried this exact night 8 winters back, and spent every winter since learning everything the doctor had told him too late, and now it came out of him in a flat, fast stream while his hands never stopped moving. Lung fever. It's in the small tubes. They swell shut. He can't clear them. We open them with steam, thin the blood with bark, keep him upright so he doesn't drown lying down. Hang that elk hide off the bunk rail. Now. She moved. He shaved a fist of bark off a length of willow he kept dried in the rafters, and a black-barked stick she did not know, and set them steeping packed snow into the iron pot, and got it boiling, and dropped in a fistful of dark, sticky leaves from a paper twist in his medicine box. "Eucalyptus," he said to her unasked question. "From the Benton traders. The Cheyenne use it. It opens the lungs." They built a tent of the elk hide over a frame of split staves, so the steam pooled thick and resinous and hot in a space the size of a coffin, and into it Maren crawled with her son, held upright against her shoulder, and breathed the steam with him, and dripped the bitter willow-bark tea between his lips, a drop at a time off the corner of a clean rag, hour after hour, while on the other side of the hide, Caleb kept the pot boiling and the fire roaring, feeding the night, and did not sleep. The fever climbed past the place where it kills. In the blackest hour, somewhere past the time when there are no hours, the boy went limp and his breath grew shallow and far apart, and Maren felt him slipping the way she had felt her own feet slip away in the snow, the body quietly deciding, and she could not get warmth into him fast enough. Her own arms were not enough. She was not a furnace. She was a frightened girl in a steam tent in the dark, losing the last thing in the world that was hers. And she said his name. Not the boy's name, his name, Caleb, for the first time, broken, the way you say a name when it is the only prayer you have left. He came into the tent. He did the thing he had not done once in 31 days. He took off his shirt and took the boy from her arms and laid the small hot body against the bare skin of his own chest, against the slow, strong drum of a living heart, and wrapped his great arms around the both of them and pulled Maren in too. So the 3 of them were sealed together inside the furs and the steam, skin to skin in the dark, the boy's flickering small life pressed between 2 grown bodies, trying, with nothing but their own heat and breath, to hold him in the world. And Caleb Wren, who had buried a wife and a child on this mountain and not wept that she ever saw, began to speak, low, steady, into the boy's wet hair. Not prayers, but names, the names of the high country. "There's a creek east of here runs even in January, I'll show you. A fox den in the rocks above the 3rd trap with kits every spring. A meadow up the back of the cliff turns blue with commas in June, so thick it looks like a lake. You haven't seen the commas. You have to stay for the commas. Holding the child in the world by promising it the world. And Maren, her arms around the both of them and her face against the man's shoulder and the steam in her lungs, felt the thing she had no word for finally find its word, and the word was not toll and not debt and not even, yet, love. The word was home. She had stopped at some point in the dark, bracing. She had stopped waiting for the price, and it had not come. The fever broke at dawn. She felt it break, felt the boy go slack in a different way, a sleeping way and not a dying way, felt the furnace gentle to a warmth, felt the rattling breath ease into the deep, even soul of a child who has come back. She got her face up off Caleb's shoulder and looked, and the boy's color had turned, the blue gone from his lips, his small chest rising and falling slow and clean, and she made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. And Caleb Wren, holding her son against his bare, scarred chest in the gray first light, looked down at the sleeping boy with 8 winters of grief breaking up behind his eyes like river ice, and his jaw worked, and he said, very low, "There he is." 2 words. There he is. As if he had been waiting at the door of the world to see who came through. And Maren understood that she had been keeping a ledger on this man since the snow, every debit she had filed against him, the size of him, the silence, the gold, the wall of distance, and that the fever-breaking had closed the account and balanced the column to a sum she had not let herself add before. She did not want the road to San Francisco. She did not want the clean rented room with the lock only she held. She wanted to see the commas come up blue in June with these two, this man and this boy, in this cabin with the mountain for its fourth wall. The wanting was so large and so unfamiliar it frightened her worse than the fever had. She had spent her whole life learning that wanting a thing was the surest way to have it taken. She did not yet know how right she was. Because down in Quartz Gulch, while the snow walked over the cabin and a fever broke and a woman learned the shape of a home, Harlan Stagg had not stopped looking for his brother's widow and his brother's son, and Harlan Stagg had found her trail. The thaw came in the second week of April, all at once, the way it does in the high country. A Chinook wind out of the southwest that ate 3 feet of snow in 2 days and turned the dooryard to mud and woke the creek under the ice to a roar and opened the pass. Maren marked it with the same dread she had once marked the closing of the pass with relief. An open road ran 2 ways. She did not say so. She and Caleb had not said any of it. They had only, since the night of the fever, begun to sit closer by the stove, and once, splitting wood, he had steadied her grip on the maul and not let go quite as fast as before, and once she had wakened in the gray to find a fold of his own blanket laid over her where it had slipped in the night, which meant he had crossed the room in the dark to do it and crossed back, and these were the only papers they signed. The boy could sit up now and reach for the firelight. Caleb let him grip one scarred finger in his whole fist and called him, gravely, the landlord, because the boy ran the cabin now, and they both knew it. They were 3 days into the thaw when Deacon the goat went stiff-legged and stared down the new bare grade and would not be milked, and Caleb came up off the chopping block in one motion with that flat gray nothing coming down over his face, and went to the cabin and took the lever-action rifle off its pegs and worked the action once to seat a cartridge, and said, without turning around, "Riders. 4, maybe 5, coming up slow." Maren's hands went still and deliberate at her sides, the loom steadiness, the bracing. "Stag," she said. It was not a question. She knew the way Caleb knew the riders, in the body, before the mind. "He waited out my husband's whole sickness to put his hand on me. He'd come the first day he could get a horse up the thaw." Caleb looked at her, and at the boy in the cartridge box, and at the open grade, and he made the cold arithmetic of a man who has been in one fight that taught him all the others. "How many guns will he bring?" he asked, "to take one woman and a baby off one trapper?" And Maren, who knew exactly the kind of coward Harlan Stagg was, under the soft hands and the contracts, said, "All of them. He won't come up here unless he can't lose, and he'll bring paper. He always brings paper." They came up the grade an hour later, 5 of them, picking through the mud and the rotten snow, and stopped 100 feet from the cabin in the open where the timber had been cut back for firewood, and the man in front held up both empty hands to show he wanted to talk first, which was the most dangerous thing about him. Harlan Stagg sat a tall horse in a good wool coat with his soft, pale face and his small smile, and beside him rode a lean, sour man with a tin star and an oilskin packet of papers across his saddlebow, Sheriff Quill, bought and paid for, who smoothed the papers and touched the star before he spoke, as if the badge did his thinking for him. Behind them sat 3 hired men with rifles across their pommels, Dab Mowery, who had laughed at her on the stage and gave that low, ugly chuckle now to the man beside him, and 2 drifters with the flat dead eyes of men paid by the day to do what they were told. 5 guns, to take one woman and a baby off one trapper, exactly as she had said. "Mrs. Stagg," Harlan called up to the cabin, pleasant as a man at a church social. "You've led us a long, cold chase. I've brought the law to make this orderly." Sheriff Quill cleared his throat and held up the oilskin packet and read, in the droning voice of a man reading a thing he has been paid not to understand, that he held a lawful writ of custody, sworn before a territorial magistrate down at the county seat, granting guardianship of the minor child of the late Thomas Stagg to the child's nearest bloodkin and natural guardian, his uncle Harlan Stagg, and further, a true copy of a binding contract of marriage conveyance under which the woman, Maren Vance, having been conveyed west and her passage and bride price paid in the sum of $11, remained bound by its terms to the Stagg household, the elder brother standing in the place of the deceased. Paper for the boy. Paper for her. Harlan had brought, as she'd said, the only weapons he trusted, a writ and a contract and 5 guns to enforce them, and the law itself dressed up to do his wanting. "It's all legal," Harlan called, smiling. "Come down and bring my nephew, and there needn't be any trouble. I'm a reasonable man. I only want what's mine." Caleb Wren stepped out of the cabin door into the mud, with the rifle held low and easy across his body, and walked, unhurried, to a place midway between the door and the riders, and stopped and looked up at the 5 mounted men with that flat gray nothing in his face, and when he spoke, his voice was low, and it carried better than a shout in the cold air. "There's a lot of paper," he said, "for one road that runs 2 ways." He let that sit. "Here's how it goes. The woman and the boy are not yours. They were never yours. You don't own a person because you paid a broker $11, and you don't own a child because you share his dead father's name. That paper says you do. The paper's wrong. I've torn up better paper than that." He shifted his weight, the smallest motion, and every hired man's eye went to the rifle. "You can turn around and take your bought sheriff and your hired guns back down my mountain, and the road's open, and you'll get to the bottom of it alive. Or you can come the last 100 feet, and you'll learn the thing every man learns up here sooner or later." His voice did not rise. "When you finally scream, the only thing that hears you is the trees." It might have ended there. With another man it would have. But Harlan Stagg had brought 5 guns precisely so that he would not have to be brave, and behind the cover of numbers even a coward finds a kind of courage, and Sheriff Quill, who had been paid, said the words that turned a standoff into a killing. "Take the child. He's resisting a lawful writ." And Dab Mowery, grinning his bad pork grin, was the first to swing his rifle up. He was fast. Caleb Wren was faster, and worse, and entirely without anger. The lever action came up and spoke once, and Dab Mowery went off the back of his horse into the mud, with the grin still on his face and a hole where his grin had been thinking from. And then the dooryard came apart into noise. Caleb moved the way she had only seen him move in the half-second of waking. Low, fast, no wasted motion, the cold mechanical focus of a wolf in a calf pen. And he put the second drifter down before the man had found a target, and took cover behind the chopping block and the woodrick as the third opened up, splinters flying off the rounds she had split with her own ruined hands. And then a rifle barked from the riders, and Caleb grunted and spun and went down behind the rick with a red bloom spreading high on his left shoulder, the rifle skidding from his grip into the mud 3 feet away. And Maren, in the cabin doorway with the boy screaming in the cartridge box behind her, saw the whole shape of how it ended. The man down and bleeding, the rifle out of his reach, 3 guns still up, and a writ that said her son belonged to the man who had paid $11 for her. And something in Maren Vance, that had been bracing her whole life, stopped bracing and started aiming. She had watched him load it and check it and clean it all winter. She had asked him once, in the dark, how it worked, and he had shown her, never thinking it would be this. She crossed the dooryard low and fast, the way she had watched him cross a room, and she did not run for the cabin and the locked door. She ran for the rifle in the mud. Her hands, when they closed on the cold, wet wood of it, her hands were not shaking. They had shaken at the chimney with the gold. They did not shake now. They had gone still and deliberate, the loom steadiness, the column balanced, and she brought the lever action up to her shoulder, the way he had shown her, and put the brass bead of the front sight on the chest of the third hired drifter, who was rising to finish Caleb behind the rick, and she worked the lever the way she had watched 100 times, and she fired. The man sat down in the mud and did not get up. She worked the lever again. The spent brass spun gold in the thin spring sun, and she swung the muzzle, smooth, unhurried, onto Harlan Stagg, who had sat his tall horse through the whole of it, the way he had sat in her doorway over her husband's grave, expecting numbers to do his work. She looked at him down the barrel over her son's screaming and her man's bleeding, and Harlan Stagg looked back at the muzzle and at her steady hands and at the two of his men face down in his brother's widow's dooryard, and the soft, pale face came apart. He did not even reach for his own gun. He came down off the horse on the wrong side, clumsy, his good wool coat in the mud, and got down on his knees in the rotten snow with his clean, soft hands up in front of his face, and he began, this man who had owned the camp and the law itself, to beg. "Now wait," he said. "Now wait. It's just paper. It's just a contract. I'll tear it up. I'll tear it all up." And Sheriff Quill sat frozen with his hand on an undrawn pistol and the oilskin packet sliding off his saddlebow into the mud, doing the only arithmetic he had left, that no amount of Stagg's money was worth what would happen if he moved his hand the last inch. He did not move it. He raised both hands slow and let them hang empty in the air. Caleb Wren got up off the ground the hard way, one-handed, his left arm hanging and the red soaking down his side, and walked out into the dooryard and took the rifle gently from Maren's steady hands, gently the way he did everything that mattered, and stood over the kneeling man, swaying, white under the dirt. He looked down at Harlan Stagg, begging in the mud with his hands over his face, and Maren watched him decide whether to end it. She did not look away. If he had pulled the trigger, she would have understood it, but Caleb Wren had buried enough on this mountain. He reached down with his good hand and lifted the oilskin packet out of the mud, the writ of custody, the contract of conveyance, all of Harlan Stagg's paper, and he tore it, one-handed, slow, the blood running off his fingers onto the pages, the writ in half, the halves to quarters, the quarters to pieces too small to read, and he let the Chinook wind scatter them down the wet grade, white shreds tumbling over the rotten snow. "There's your custody," he said. "There's your contract. There's your bride price. The boy's got a mother. The mother's got a home. And the next paper that comes up this pass, I won't tear. I'll bury whoever carries it next to the others, and the trees will hear him, and no one else ever will. Now get off my mountain." And Harlan Stagg got up out of the mud and got on his horse the wrong way twice before he made it, and he and the bought sheriff turned down the open road and did not look back, and they and the bodies of the three who had not been cowards enough to live went down the pass and out of Maren Vance's life. She got Caleb inside. The rifle ball had gone through the meat high on his shoulder and out the back, missing the bone, a clean two-sided hole that would not stop bleeding, and no doctor lay within 2 days' hard ride. And a man had died on this mountain once before because the doctor was 2 days away. So Maren Vance did the thing her hands had been training for all her life without either of them knowing it. She built up the fire, boiled water, washed the wound front and back with the last of his trade whiskey, threaded a curved needle from his own kit with waxed saddle thread, and set her jaw, and her hands went still and deliberate. The loom steadiness, the same stillness that had held a thread against a never-stopping machine and split a winter's wood and laid a brass bead on a man's chest, and she sewed Caleb Wren shut. Front and back, small even stitches, tighter than a factory would have set them, the one skill she owned that had never failed her, now keeping a man in the world, the way his steam tent and his bark tea and his bare chest had kept her son in the world. He bore it without a sound, watching her face the whole time, and when she tied off the last stitch and bit the thread, he said, "Lo, that's tighter than the doctor would have put it." The same thing he'd said about his coat. And she understood it was the highest thing he knew how to say, and she laughed, wet, and pressed her forehead to his good shoulder, and stayed there. She nursed him through the fever that came after, 3 days of it, and it was her turn to keep the pot boiling and the names coming, and on the worst night she did for him what he had done for the boy, lay down beside him under the firs and held him through the shaking, skin to skin in the dark, no paper between them, and somewhere in those 3 days the last wall went down, and when the fever left him and he opened the gray eyes clear and found her there, neither of them reached for a word like toll or debt because there were no more accounts between them. He was up and moving in a week, stiff and one-armed and impossible to keep still, and the high country came on toward summer, and one warm morning in the last of April, He did the thing his whole moral law had been building toward, the thing that cost him more than the rifle ball had. He went to the chimney and took out the tin from behind the stone, the poke of gold dust the size of 2 fists, and put it in Maren Vance's hands, and said, "The road's open. It runs to Corinne and the railhead, and on to San Francisco, like you wanted the day you came up here. There's dust here to set you up in a clean room with a sewing machine and a lock only you hold the key to. You and the boy, free and clear, owing nobody, ever. I'll break trail for you far as the way station." His jaw worked. "I won't ask you to stay. A man who asks you to stay after the winter you've had is just another man putting a price on you. So I'm not asking. I'm handing you the road." And he set the gold in her hands and stepped back and gave her the thing no one had given her in 21 years, the choice made wholly and only her own, with nothing owed and no one to please. Maren Vance stood in the cabin with a fortune in her 2 hands and looked at the open door and the bright wet grade running down toward the world she had spent her whole life trying to reach. And then she looked at the man who had handed it to her, white and one-armed and stitched shut by her own hand, expecting nothing, asking nothing. And she did the arithmetic one last time, the honest column she had kept her whole life, and it came out the way it had come out the dawn the fever broke. The road was just a thing that ran 2 ways, and everything she wanted was on this end of it. She crossed the room. She knelt down by the hearth where she had once knelt with the same gold and a knife in her hand, braced for the worst, and this time her hands were not shaking. She pried up the loose floor plank by the chimney with the bone-handled knife she no longer carried up her sleeve, and she set the poke of gold dust down into the cold, dark earth beneath the home she was choosing. Not throwing the freedom away, keeping it safe under her own floor, where only she knew it lay, but refusing, finally and forever, to spend it on leaving. And on top of the gold, she set the small brass fare check, the punched stage token that a company had thrown into the snow because her body and her child's life were worth less to it than $4.10. The thing that had condemned her, the thing she had carried up the mountain in her frozen fist, because it was the last thing anyone had handed her. She fit the plank back down over the both of them, and she stood up. "There," she said, "now it can't punch anybody." But Caleb Wren took it back up. He pried the plank loose again with his one good hand and lifted out the brass fare check, left the gold where she had buried it, and carried the little token across the room and took a square nail and his hammer off the shelf, and he drove the nail through the punched hole in the center of it and fixed the fare check to the mantel shelf above the stove where the firelight could reach it. So the thing that had marked her as freight now sat in the warmest spot in the house she had chosen, nailed flat where the road could never punch it again. They stood and looked at it, the 2 of them, the boy babbling in his box by the warm stove and reaching his fat fists at the firelight. "Leave it where we can see it," Caleb said, "so we don't forget what the world charged for you." And then he said the only vow either of them ever made, no church and no magistrate and no paper, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder, steady, the way she steadied a thread. "You're not for sale. You never were. You're home." And Maren Vance, 21 years old, a widow and a loom girl, and a thing that had been conveyed west on a paper and thrown off a stage into a blizzard for the want of $4.10, stood in a one-room cabin with a mountain for its 4th wall and a sleeping fortune under her floor and a brass fare check shining on the mantel and a man's steady hand on her shoulder and a fat, loud living boy reaching for the fire. And she chose, with both hands and her whole heart and nothing owed, to stay. The commas came up blue in the meadow, up the back of the cliff that June, thick as a lake, just the way he'd promised it to a dying baby in the dark. The boy saw it. They all 3 did. That was tonight's story from Timberline Hearts. The world put a price on her and threw her in the snow for being short of it, and a silent man up the pass spent a whole winter proving that some things don't have a price at all. When the stage left her in the blizzard because she couldn't pay, the mountain man carried her up the pass, and then he spent the cold months teaching her that being carried and being owned are not the same thing. Tell me down in the comments, Would you have stayed by the warm stove with the baby, or grabbed the Winchester and crossed that dooryard? I think I know which kind of woman Maren turned out to be. The cold is cruel, but the bond is unbreakable. Keep the stove hot, leave one thing nailed where you can see it, so you never forget what you came through, and I'll see you up the pass next week.